Morning, fish keepers. Cam and John here. How are we all doing? Hopefully well. We've done it. We've made it to Friday. Hip, hip, hooray. We have ourselves a special guest waiting in the wings. Today, we're going to be talking about something I have no idea about. We're talking about Mudskippers, and I'm absolutely fizzing about it. So we'll bring on our guest. Push the buttons. Welcome, Joakim.
Welcome. Thanks.
Thank you for coming on this.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. So before we get started, can you please just tell the people, the viewers, who you are and what you're all about?
Yeah, totally. So my name is Joakim. I'm originally from Sweden, now living in New Zealand. I was supposed to be here for a year. It's been 15 now. So it's an amazing place to be. If you haven't been to New Zealand, can definitely recommend to come and visit. It's totally going to captivate your heart. My background is in basically my working background is in zookeeping and horticulture, and then with a big interest in paleontology, a few other interesting kind of interest in like certain species of plants, orchids and ferns, palms, and lots of different animals. But my kind of real big passion and what I really feel a lot about is actually Mudskippers. I've been working as a zookeeper for almost the past 20 years, but from there I've kind of more glided into more field work conservation now. So I've worked with, I used to work at, back in Sweden, I used to work at a public aquarium in Stockholm. Moving over to New Zealand, I started my own little ecological restoration project called Timotikarang and Miramar Ecological Restoration. So we're all volunteers in the bush trying to plant back native trees. We planted over 27,000 now in the past couple of years, so making a huge difference. And we're based in Miramar, which is now a predator-free environment in terms of free from introduced mammalian predators like rats, stoats, weasels. And that was actually my job after working at Wellington Zoo. So I was at the zoo for a few years, then jumped into actually working on the ground here, making the peninsula free of rats and things like that. And now when actually Miramar was declared free of rats, kind of got it in more over into deal with invasive species like pest plants and things, aquatic plant, different kind of invasive weeds, old man's beard, cape ivy. The list can be very long, basically. So that's my normal day-to-day job now, basically working as a supervisor, looking after teams in the field, dealing with invasive weeds, and then during the winter months we do native restoration plantings, basically. But on the side of that, that's my job. And when I'm not out planting trees, then I'm basically at home tending to my Mudskippers, which is my big passion, basically, and something I've spent pretty much my whole life as having a big passion about. And yeah, it's very exciting, constantly learning new things as well. But yeah,
cool.
That's a short version. That's a short version.
So what drew your initial interest into Mudskippers?
So being a kid, very interested in nature and a lot of animals and plants. I've ever since, there's always been an aquarium in the pictures as far as I can remember. My dad was quite the aquarist, like in the hobby as well. So he had lots of aquariums growing up. I apparently fell into an aquarium when I was a kid. I can't remember this, but I apparently climbed up on it and fell into it and then smashed the window from the inside. And they decided to downsize a little bit after that. But yeah, there's always been aquariums and fish and wildlife in the picture of my life. And I had lots of aquariums as a kid. But then in 1989, my dad took me to Australia on a bit of a backpacking trip from Brisbane all the way up to Cairns and Port Douglas. And I was 9 years old at the time. Didn't know that much about Australian wildlife, but I had this book about the Great Barrier Reef, and that was the reason why I wanted to go to that place as well. I don't know how much I was pestering him back then about going there, but we went there and we were in Australia for a month and a half. And as a 9-year-old kid, there's so much new things you've never seen and to explore. But it was like, don't touch that, don't touch that, don't lift that rock. Something's gonna jump out and bite you, and then you. But
sounds like a story.
Yeah. But then I think we were at Airlie Beach, and Dad was gonna find a little boat going on a fishing tour or something like that. And I remember standing outside this little office depot by the water's edge, and there was a tide pool there. And as I approached that tide pool with a big driftwood log over, I remember this so well, actually, which is so interesting. But I just approached it, and all these small little jumping things came off of it and then disappeared underneath the log. And I thought they were frogs, but it was very weird because it's like frogs, saltwater, brackish, somewhere around there. That didn't really make sense, and they didn't really look like frogs that much either. But there were lots of them. They all disappeared as I approached. So then I thought, okay, well, I'll go back a few meters away, see if they show up, which they did not. So I disappeared for a couple of minutes, and then I came back, and I saw the whole thing happening again. Right. And by that stage, my dad had finished his business basically at a boat renting company. And I was like, oh, Dad, there was some weird stuff around there. He's like, oh, that's okay. We don't have time for this now. So anyway, so we left there. But then as we came up to Cairns, I saw the same things again along the esplanade, moving around in the mud, basically. And this back in 1989, Cairns wasn't as developed as it is now. The esplanade was just basically a concrete ledge and mud flats. Beautiful. There was no promenade really or anything like that. If you go back to Cairns now, it's beaches and volleyball nets, hotels, everything. But I managed to catch a mudskipper, thinking that, and I was catching it with my hands because I used to catch fish by my hands when I was a kid. Basically, try to like small pikes, for example. I would see them in the lakes in Sweden. I'm standing close to the water's edge. You would basically distract them with your hand in front of them like that, but then you would just try to come up and grab them from the back. So that's what I did with this guy. And there's a little photo of me holding this little mudskipper like that. And I was like, Dad, this is what I saw. He's like, oh, that's a mudskipper, son. And from that day, I remember thinking, this is going to be my passion for the rest of my life. And it still is. Wow. And yeah, and then I was like, mudskippers, I want one as a pet. I want to know more about these guys. But back in 1989, there was no internet. There was very limited information on these guys. There was no mudskippers in the aquarium books or anything like that. So you had to look at books about different countries and ecosystems, and it would maybe have a little headline about a mudskipper fish that lives on land. And then coming back to Sweden, growing up, I asked around every single pet shop if they had mudskippers. And they sometimes would say, yes, we do. And then you would go there and no, it's not a mudskipper, some kind of pleco or some other bottom living fish that crawls around in the mud. But then there was one day basically where there was a pet shop. Half the tank was water. There was a few floating bits of cork. It was on the top shelf, and I couldn't actually really see. There was kind of half rubbed out whiteboard pen saying Mudskipper or slamkrypare in Swedish, which translate to sludge crawler. And I asked the guy, and he's like, "Oh, the pet shop owners," and he's like, "Oh no, I just sold them." And I've been at that stage. It's been close to 6 years from when I first saw them in Australia, basically. 5, 6 years, somewhere on there. 1995, yeah. But then he said, I can actually get you some. It will take a couple of months, but I can get you some. And I was very patiently waiting. And I actually paid up front as well, just to make sure we could get this. I remember running home. It's like, Dad, they can get me Mudskippers. Can I get some money? Yeah, so I basically kept Mudskippers and the West African species, which it was the Periphthalmus barbarus. It was just coming into the year between 95 and 96 there, so that winter. So that was a really good early Christmas gift for me that year.
So what is it that keeps you interested in them then?
Well, yeah, so I mean, it's okay. So for the people here who might not actually know really what Mudskippers are, and so I'm going to show you this. So this is a little model I made.
Wow.
So they're basically fish then, right? They're part of the goby family, but they're fish that lives on land. So it's very different from any other kind of fish you have. And so this is a little representation I've made on two of these guys sitting on a bit of a rock. You can see the kind of footprints they make as well as they crawl up through the more water's edge. But being basically a fish that lives on land, it's a whole different kind of animal. You know, it's not your regular fish. It's not a frog. You kind of can look after them as a frog. I've kept frogs, salamanders, lizards, and all these kind of different things. And this is somewhere in between, right? And almost from having a big interest in paleontology and prehistoric stuff, this is kind of evolution, you know, how fish went up on land. So we're seeing that in action. The kind of different things with these guys is a lot of people are like, oh, these are like living fossils. They're not. They're basically the latest of the fish to have evolved. So fish are basically just, again, trying to get up on land. So yeah, it's basically a whole different things. I mean, hard to explain why there's a love for them or a passion. You know, it just feels like that's something that's right. But yeah, it's very amazing. We don't know that much. We're still learning. They're really fascinating. They're not just sitting there doing nothing. They're really active. They can get really friendly, really tame. They can easily hand feed, or in some cases, I've had guys, you know, you put your hand down and they will jump up into the hand, and you can just like look around and really interact with them.
Wow.
You can't do that with many fish.
No. I mean, some fish are really like tuned into you when you enter the room and things like that. But these guys are like, it's so different because sure, these guys see me, the Mudskipper I have behind me here. These guys see me when I enter the room, but they're just like, they go up to the window, but it's like, okay, maybe there's nothing for me today. But you can see the way they kind of interact with their environment. It's one of the few kind of fish that can kind of move their head a little bit independently to the rest of the body. So you can like look down and look at different things, and you see the eyes moving as well. So it's something very different, and I like that.
Yeah.
Wow. And we've had a comment from one of the watchers. We'll just bring that up quickly. Yep. Zin has said, I'm going to butcher these names, but I'll try it anyway. I kept Periophalamus gracilis.
Yeah,
I might have got close, I might not have. And I've had a hard time finding a good source to get more now, as the rules in Hawaii changed. And wondered if there are any other species that are non-aggressive.
Yeah, so with Mudskippers, they're all pretty aggressive, but the aggressiveness do range a little bit depending on the species. Gracilis is one of the smaller ones. And if they want to get more and not as aggressive, I would probably look at Perithalamus novem radiatus, Pierce's Mudskipper. It's one of the species that is actually most commonly kept in the trade, however, under the name Indian Mudskipper. And this is where it gets very confused as well, because there's so many species in India. But in the trade, it's known as Indian Mudskipper. And it's one of the smaller species. It can grow up to 6 centimeters, but usually somewhat smaller, and not as aggressive if you manage to tick the boxes of setting up a good setup or habitat for them.
So when you say aggressive, can you explain their aggression a little bit?
Yeah, so Mudskippers are all very territorial. They're very defending their own territories, which in some species is quite large. So if you're looking at the species, some of the species have like a square meter that they're looking after, and it's actually both sexes are just as aggressive. So it can be really tricky to actually work with several Mudskippers in one setup. So this is where you have to make sure that you kind of tick some boxes of a really good setup in terms of visual barriers. So everybody can have their own little space in the tank. But yeah, November radiatus, Pearson's Mudskipper, is one of the smaller species. So that would be my recommendation to look for.
Cool.
And gracilis would otherwise be my second option. So it's really cool that they managed to get gracilis, because I haven't encountered that in the trade that often, and especially in Hawaii. That's awesome.
So when you say aggression, are they like actively chasing each other off, or are they being involved in like proper fighting combat, trying to rip each other's head off sort of scenario? Like what level of aggression are we kind of looking at here?
Yeah, so you're basically looking. So first you have a lot of visual aggression, fin racing. So Mudskippers have, if you're looking at this guy again, the model I made. So you have your, let's look at that guy. So you have basically two dorsal fins. This is one of the ways they're communicating. So there's a lot of fin racing and things like that. A lot of standoff, a lot of head racing, open mouth, trying to look bigger. If that doesn't really work, then they will be actively chasing. This is also why often you have to clean the aquarium glass very often if you have mud as a substrate, because it just gets really muddy and unclean, basically. But yeah, lots of chasing. And like I said, some species are more aggressive than others, but I've had actual head ripping as well, where one guy lost an entire front skin from the eyes down to the mouth.
Wow.
Yeah, so they will kill each other if the space is not sufficient.
Yeah. We've had another question from William. Any tank mates that could work with Mudskippers?
So a little bit species specific. So you kind of, with Mudskippers, want to aim for a more species specific setup just for Mudskippers. But in some cases, you can, for example, get fiddler crabs working with Mudskippers. But this is also very depending on the species. I've also had the Mudskippers totally going for crabs, and basically ripping every single leg and claws till you basically just have the poor body of the crab who's still alive, basically. But they will eat crabs. It's a part of the natural diet as well. When you're looking at other fish, you're starting to then kind of looking at a different kind of setup for these guys, which is not in all cases that ideal. Mudskippers usually avoid deep water. And if you want to have other fish as well, that means you're going to have quite a large tank to make sure you actually meet all the requirements that these guys need. So usually I would say tank mates for Mudskippers, I would usually say no. But in some cases, you can get certain species of crabs, non-aggressive crabs, working with them. Other things like shrimps, they will eat them. But it's a little bit of a, you have to trial it almost and test it, which is not always great, because if you have other species of crabs that might be too aggressive, they will go for your Mudskippers as well and try to eat those.
So you're obviously in the slightly brackishy type water, and I'm assuming they work as the tides go up, tides go down, tide goes down, they've got the mud to roam around and that sort of stuff. How do they work when the tide comes up in their natural environment?
So this is a little bit depending on the species and the genus of Mudskipper you have. So some Mudskippers, they will follow the tide, just back up and down. So the water basically goes high tide, they will just venture further into land. And just hang around the muddy estuary bits up there, or if it's mangroves, they will just go deeper into the mangroves. Other species, they will just basically cling to anything that's floating or sticking above the water, and then climb up on that. And then there's the more aquatic group of Mudskippers. They will actually just burrow in their underground burrows in the mud and just wait it out till the next tide goes out. So yeah,
cool.
Yeah, so it's a lot of like movements. Some go up, just follow the water up and down, up and down. Other just cling above the water to anything they can find that's above the surface. And other just go underground and just wait in their burrow, which usually have then a big air pocket where they're still getting that amphibious life stage.
Ah, okay.
That's fascinating. Do they sort of climb up things a little bit to not sort of drown, or just grip onto stuff?
So they will basically do, again, different depending on what kind of Mudskipper they have, because basically with their sacral fins, the fin that's at the very bottom here, in some species that's actually become a suction cup, and they can climb on anything that's actually vertical, pretty much. They're just sucking to this to the ground, to the let's say it's a seawall or something like that, and they can climb very well. So if you're looking at my tank behind me for these guys, you can actually see. So my tank is it's a tidal tank. You can roughly see the line where the high tide is. It's currently low tide, or another 2 hours, 3 hours, and then the line goes up to high tide about that. But I have my Mudskippers crawling all the way up to that piece of mangrove, all the way up here. They really can climb really well. That when you say when people say fish can't climb trees, that's not true. We've had these guys climbing up way about 30 centimeters just on branches, finding their way up.
Wow.
So we're looking for these guys in the tank every morning. I have to look up here as well.
Wow.
Have you ever had them escape the tank completely?
Not these guys, but in the past. So you have to make sure you have a really secure setup, because they can, and especially when they're small, they just stuck to the glass and just go straight up on the glass. Just like just trying to keep a gecko in a tank, basically, where they can just climb up and down the glass as well.
It's fascinating. We've had a couple of other questions from the chat, but I just want to quickly touch on your tidal tank and how does that work?
Yeah, that's something I can't wrap my head around at all.
Yeah, how does that function? That sounds fantastic.
Yeah, so to kind of best practice meet all the requirements of what Mudskippers really like and enjoy, and you add a lot of environmental enrichment and actually keeping down the aggressiveness of Mudskippers. Tidal tanks is the best you can do for them. So in the case of my tank here behind, so this is actually 2 tanks on top of each other. So underneath this is basically the sump. I think it's a little bit untidy down there, but I can roughly show you what it looks like. So down here, basically, that's the sump, or where we basically keep. I don't know how visual that is. Actually, I can turn on the lights here as well.
I love how tall that tank is.
Yeah, it's misleading. It's a lot bigger than I actually thought. Not until he's standing. That's awesome.
Pretty big, actually.
Yeah,
I love how tall it is.
Project. Yeah, so basically down here, it's a little bit hard to see, but down there we basically have the sump, but that's also where all the water is during the tides. So when it's low tide in the top tank, it's high tide at the bottom tank, basically.
Yeah.
And basically when we made this, and it's one of the mothers just here, the other one is in the back. There's 3 of them in there. And that guy was just told off by this. There's 3 of them living here. When we basically had this tank made up, we drilled holes at the bottom of the top tank. So I'm going to aim up a little bit so you can see me. So there's basically 3 holes drilled at the top tank, connected with pipes that basically looks like this. I made a little arrangement here of things I can show. Yeah. So a couple of pipes like that. One for inlet, where the pump pumps up water. And then one that's a little bit lower. That's your lowest point of your low tide. And then we basically have, well, I can just do it like that. And then we have the highest high tide, which is the pipe that's higher. I don't know how well you can actually see here. Actually, maybe. Hopefully I didn't screw up anything if I take this. Do you guys want to see a bit closer?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's incredibly fascinating.
If I can do this here. So you can see the middle. You can see where's my finger? There. So, well, here's the little. I don't know. I have to do everything backwards here. So that's your lowest point of your low tide, and then the green. That's your the pumps in the water, and then the other pipe is actually hidden in the far back here, and that's your high tide. So everything is just connected to a regular pump underneath in the sump, which is then connected to a timer. So when the timer flicks on, the water just pumps up water through here. And then, of course, it will then drain out at the lowest point, except all these pipes are connected with valves, so we can regulate the speed of the flow. So you want the high tide water to slowly rise up in about 25, 30 minutes. Well, somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes if you want to have it somewhat natural. So the pump actually pumps in water slightly faster than what actually drains. And in the wild, the high tide always comes in faster than it actually goes out. And then it kind of hits eventually the high tide pipe, and it just naturally gravity drains down into the bottom tank, and then just goes around and around and around.
Ah.
Wow, that is cool.
So was this a design that you made yourself, or is it something that's...
No, I basically made the ideas myself as well. I had a tidal tank back home in Sweden as well, but that was more of I hadn't figured out all the details yet, and this was a couple of years ago. So that was more of a manual tide, having to go in there, turn it on, twist the valves and things. So it's been always a little bit developing, basically, and coming up with new ways of doing this, and kind of how can we make this more efficient, more smooth in a way. But yeah, just a regular aquarium pump, which at least a pump that can push water at least a meter up, basically.
So how often does it go up and down throughout the day?
So I have high tide twice in 24 hours. So every 6 hours. So every 6 hours it goes down or up. So usually, and with Mudskippers, basically you want at least one of the high tides to be at nighttime, in case you ever want to try to work towards trying to breed them. But that's a whole different story. It's very, very rare. And funny enough, we have actually Mudskipper fry currently in the sump of a species.
Hey!
Fantastic.
As far as we know, this is the first record of fry in this species.
Hey, that is fantastic.
We just discovered that 2 days ago. So now I'm just like, I don't know what to do. I kind of know what I need to work towards. They're in the sump where there's like the pumps and stuff. It's not ideal, but I don't have anywhere else to put them. But yeah, it's really cool. So basically, there's one guy in Germany who's managed to breed 2 or 3 species. And there's Chris in Brisbane who's managed to get fry of his Mudskipper species as well, which is variabilis, I think. No, hang on. No, he has Garcilis as well. But for this species, the Barbarus, which is the West African species, I have not heard of anyone ever managed to get breeding out of those guys. And we just found this 2 days ago here. So very exciting. But to breed Mudskippers, you need to tick a couple of boxes. You need mud, and you need tidal. And then to actually raise the fry as well, you basically need to have it's called a Chrysler tank, where water just circles around and around, like some kind of tank setup that you breed seahorses or jellyfish in.
Yes.
Because Mudskipper fry, as they basically leaves the water, they will basically become planktonic for the first month or so and just drift with currents. So it's that's a whole different new research and pretty exciting. But very cool.
Congratulations. That is ridiculously cool.
Yeah. So we have I've taken a couple of videos. I mean, they're 2 millimeters basically, so hard to see them. It took me a long time to figure out what I was actually seeing, and then my heart started pounding. Managed to basically get Mudskipper breeding. Sorry, now I just lost what I was going to say. Anyway, very exciting.
Pure excitement.
Yeah, it is actually. It's very cool. I basically dropped everything I was doing and I've been doing for the past 2 days now. But yeah, it's fascinating animals basically, and how to raise Mudskipper fry, or larvae. That's a whole new topic that we're just starting to explore.
They must have known that you were going to come on this and you wanted something really exciting to share. So they're like, hey, we're going to make this happen for you.
Yeah. I've kind of seen some behaviors pointing towards some kind of, courtshipping. And so with Mudskippers, when you want to have a setup, it's called Mudskipper for a reason, right? As well, you can find Mudskippers in other kind of environments in the wild. You might find them on on a sandy beach or on a rocky foreshore. But those are always habitats that they are just kind of briefly passing through in their life stage as they're moving towards finding a muddy estuary, because they always breed. They always need to breed in burrows in the mud where it's underground. You can't have breeding mudskippers, for example, on a rocky foreshore or on a sandy beach, because sand, as it gets wet, will eventually collapse if you dig a tunnel. It's too fragile. You need the right kind of cohesion and plasticity. Yeah, basically to have them, as mud, it's so perfect building because it will hold the structures really well. And then you need the tides as well, because the male will basically look after the egg in that burrow in an air pocket in the mud. So he needs to transport air into that burrow as well. So we've seen that happening here. So I was like, what are you guys doing? Are you doing what I'm thinking? And we managed to film a little bit of courtshipping as well, which is also very exciting. So I will post that. So there is the Mudskipper group on Facebook, which is a really, really great group. It's bunch of world-leading Mudskipper people in it, and scientists. There's some actual scientists as well. That's written books and everything on more on the science point of view, and feel like how does their eye works, for example, right? Because you have a fish that lives on land, you need a whole totally different kind of eye to be able to live on land. For example, these guys can blink. No other fishes can really blink. They do that by basically putting down their eyes in their orbital sockets and softening, like dampening them and then popping it out again. I'm not going to go into too much of the science details, basically, because that's even next level. But these guys, the anatomy of their eye is more similar to animals living on land than a fish. They can see in 3D, for example. And with their eyes on top of the very head, they can see basically in 360 as well. So these have a really good visionary field of what's going on. And that's also when you're trying to keep them in a tank, and you have several of them, and the aggressiveness, you have to make sure that you have a couple of driftwoods, barrier bits between them, so they can't actually see each other, unless they actually go up on it. So yeah.
So do you think the UV light has played a part in the breeding?
Good question.
Yeah. So possibly. So we know in some species of fish, even in the ones living underwater, some damsels in the reefs and things, they use UV light as a way of recognizing members of their own species. If there is a threatening male versus a pregnant female or something like that. We don't know that much about these guys yet, if that's a requirement. My bet is that adding UV light does add to animal welfare, a better practice. That there might be some kind of using the UV to. We might not see it because our eyes is maybe a little bit different as well, but maybe their colors look slightly different on the UV light as well. And yeah, so I reckon that UV could be useful, but we don't actually know that much about it. There's hardly no research at all if UV light is required for fish husbandry, not for like UV for killing, algae in the waters through, going through it, not a UV filter, an actual UV light for, amphibians and reptiles.
Yeah. Under the UV, certain patterns and colors become visible to those species that we can't see, and that helps them recognize certain conditions and whether they're breeding or they're threatening or being defensive and things as well. So it must play a part to some extent, especially with the courtship stage.
Exactly. And then there's a case of, also UVB, like, the uptake of D vitamin, so you prevent metabolic bone diseases and things. So it's probably ticking a few boxes as well. So my bet is I think UV definitely helps. It might not be necessary for fish. A lot of fish in the wild, they will uptake their D vitamin by eating the algae that's been, exposed to sunlight. But for a fish that gets exposed on tidal mudflats and things like that, and maybe for courtshipping and behavioral. I mean, these guys are breeding. We have UV light in here. Is UV light required for that?
Yeah. Have the other people that have reproduced them had UV over their setups? Have you discussed that with people yet? Like,
I haven't actually, so I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, that's obviously could be a question with maybe they did as well, and you've between the 3 and 4, you kind of just begun unlocking a little key element here as well.
So this is why that Facebook group is a really good little group, because it collects all these people with the same interest and passion basically at one place, and you can have a discussion. We have a few small, chat boards as well about these guys and how to basically look after them and what to feed them and all that. And that's a whole different thing as well, because what do you feed these guys with? One of the biggest things for Mudskippers. So some of these species, like the ones behind me, I've worked with individuals that are over 15 years old.
You are.
Yeah. But in most cases, they're probably, dying off way faster or earlier, just because we're not meeting some of those, ticking the boxes. Chronic stress is the biggest killer in Mudskippers. That's usually what I say. The next one is gastrointestinal, I like stomach issues.
Yeah.
Eating the wrong things. And so, for example, so often you see, online or pet shops giving out information like feed these guys mealworms. It's not great. Mealworms are very fatty. So, and obeseness and overweight in fish is an actual issue as well. So mealworms, wax moth, things like that, it's too fatty. You need more. In the wild, these guys would be going around feeding on what they find in those tide pools or filter. Some species are filter feeding, other ones are more actively hunting. Diet change with age and seasons as well, which for a lot of animals in the wild it does. And of course you want to make sure you meet all these different kind of requirements as well. For example, I reckon that a lot of stomach issues for these guys is that they don't actually get enough greens. Not enough fiber. So, and if you're looking at some studies, it seems like to a certain stage of life during certain seasons, like 30% of their diet is algae-based food. And you can't really hand feed them like a sinking pellet. Doesn't really work that well, unless you're really softening it up before. I think that a lot of food that's been given to these guys is too dry. So you give them dry flake fodder, and then they will eat that as it is, but then it starts swelling in their stomachs as well. So yeah.
Kind of like feeding flake food to bedders does the same thing. Sitting on top, one side's wet, one side's dry, draw it in, the moisture inside expands it and pops them out a little bit. Yeah. Similar type theory. Yeah.
So I've seen some Mudskippers. I've seen people online posting like, what's going on with my Mudskipper? Like it's having, the stomach is rupturing and things like that. And I think it's overfeeding. Feed a lot of small things more often rather than bulk feeds. I feed these guys twice a day currently, as they are still just coming up to a maturing age as well. They're quite fast growing, but also as they go adult as well, a star day or two here and there. And then it's different food depending on species. We know, for example, that Periophthalmodon septemviradiatus, the main diet in the wild is actually ants. Ants, yeah. And this is one of the more terrestrial species of Mudskippers as well. If you disturb them, they will just disappear up on land into the bushes and hide somewhere there and just wait it out till they come back and just dampening their skin. They're basically spending almost like 85-90% of the time on land. They just basically need to dampen their skin every now and then. They live so far inland in some cases that they don't even get that affected by the tide, so they just hang around the stream edges, and there's very, very low salinity in the water, hardly none even in some cases. But then, of course, you get flooding and storms, so water will still change a little bit. And that's also one of the species that you quite often actually encounter in the trade. So if people could, feed them something that was more ant based, that would be really cool. Which I used to do that. That's a species I kept in Sweden. I managed to get my ones there into kind of courtshiping and breeding mode, but never burrowing, because my mud at that stage wasn't deep enough. And stupidly enough, didn't think about it at the time, and this is where I've learned as well, but I was actually heating up that setup with heating cables under the mud. And in the wild, if you are digging down, it should get colder the deeper down you dig, right? Not warmer. So they will start burrow, but then stop. So yeah, that's where it's like, oh, hang on, that isn't a great way. And that comes into the whole, like, how do you create a setup for these guys? It's not your regular aquarium. You want to have more, I wouldn't say this is an aquarium. This is a paludarium, Yeah. You have more land and water. So with Mudskippers, 2/3 of your setup should be land. Should ideally have mud as a substrate for long term. Well, short term, you can have something else, but long term, and I say short term, I wouldn't say more than a couple of months, ideally. And then lots of kind of driftwoods, hiding areas, overhang of things, and then heat up. Totally depends on your setup, how large it is, but heat lamps. So you want to have a warmer air temperature than a water temperature. So you want to have your temperature somewhere between 27 and 30 degrees. It can even, ideally, it even changes at nighttime, a little bit colder at night, a little bit warmer in the day. Water somewhere around 26, 27, 28. In our tank, I see this tank has been running for 4 years. And we see quite interestingly how the temperature of the tank also correlates with the temperature outside here in Wellington. It's really windy and wet and rainy today here.
That doesn't sound like Wellington at all.
No, I know. But yeah, heating up your setup so you can almost see. So in this tank, I have 2 heat lamps. There's just one. Sorry. No, there's one there, and then one on the other side. So 2 lamps for this guy. So they basically look like this. So it's good then to have either, depending on the size of your tank, but either one lamp in the middle or basically 2 on either side, so you get somewhat uniform heating. And you want a actual lamp that's either really, really well protected by fine mesh, because you don't want to get water on your heat lamp unless you have a ceramic heat lamp. Then that's a bit more tolerant, basically. But otherwise, if you use a glass one, they might actually explode if they get water on them, because these guys splash around a lot in the water. So basically, a heat lamp sitting above your tank like that. And this model is kind of cool because it actually glows in the dark. And these guys are actually active at nighttime, or at least dusk and dawn as well. So it doesn't go completely pitch black for them. They have some kind of light that they can see, so they can still move around. They can still feed if they want to. In this setup, actually, we have one of those fake little moonlights as well in the far back. So at nighttime, we have a little moon that lights up the tank, giving it quite an interesting shine to it. Sorry, I'm just talking away here now. More people questions? You might have questions, or just blown away.
You've given me gazillions of questions. I am trying to unmuddle my mind right now. I like this. I'm happy. This is cool.
That's very cool.
We'll run through a couple of the comments first, and then we'll get to some of the questions that I have. William just said, thanks for the great answer. It's nice seeing a fellow Swede.
Yeah, he's talking about meatballs there as well.
Meatballs?
Yeah, he was saying, hey, I shot bullar. So talking about, yeah, we go meatballs.
Cool. The Great Ocean Disaster would like to know, with aggression, is it better to have male-female rather than male-male or female-female, or is there a difference?
There's no difference, really. Females can be just as aggressive. So you have to kind of trial. There's no real sexual ratio or what works better with others. I've had females being just as aggressive towards each other than a male to female. So yeah, it's basically, you have to trial your way. I've had fish that I put together and then have to separate and then try with another couple to see what works well. And sometimes it works, sometimes it don't. And of course, there will be also aggressiveness during certain time of years, how, if they are in reproductive mode or not. So sometimes during the year they will be fine with each other's company, and sometimes they won't. So that's where you have, again, to make sure your tank meets all the standard criteria to kind of make sure everybody gets their space.
William has also asked, what do you use for, basically, what type of mud do you use?
Yeah, so so the mud is a totally best practice husbandry to working with Mudskippers, basically. So there's a few options as well, and this is also the hardest thing to do to Mudskippers. Where do I source my mud from? How do we make mud? Or most places don't sell mud either. So I usually say there's kind of 3 options. You can make your own mud by buying clay for pottery, like terracotta pottery. Just make sure you get one that's a natural product that doesn't have any additives or coloration or has plastic components. You want to have a natural clay, basically. And then you basically want to add the organic compounds or compartments to that. So there is actually a really cool recipe online on how to make mud. It's on if you go into the Facebook group and the group the files, there's the recipe there. So it's basically, I can't remember now the exact numbers now on top of my head, but basically it tells you this much of that mud, this much of this mud. Then you want to add things like coconut fiber to it. The Sumed reptile soil has a really good setup as well of different things, moss and things that you want to add to it. So that's one way you can make your own mud. The other option is actually you can buy mud if you're really, really lucky finding a supplier. There's supplier in the States who actually source their mud from the wild and then sell it as it is. Quite heavy though, because mud is heavy. For a liter of wet mud, that might be the equivalent of 4 kg.
Wow.
Yeah, so really heavy. So for this tank behind us here, we actually had to put in extra support, like extra beams under the floor, just to make sure that the floor would actually. There's almost 180 liters of mud in that tank.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Okay.
So it's quite heavy. So it's quite.
Yeah.
We had actually a builder coming in here and actually making that tank so we could make sure that it would actually hold up the whole weight of it. And then he went down, crawled in under the house just to make sure that actually the house would be able to hold up the tank as well, because it's an old house from the 1930s, wood basically. So yeah, you can buy mud. So it's quite often branded under lotus mud or mud for water lilies for ponds. And there's a few suppliers in Europe. Like Bauhaus, it's a German chain company. Yeah, they sell in some of those stores in Sweden, for example, in Finland. They don't have a store in Norway, but they are scattered across Europe. They actually sell quite nice North Atlantic sourced mud that they have for water lilies. And you can buy quite a nice big bag of that. And that mud is the one I've been using while living in Sweden, and it's a really good, nice quality one. And then there's this third option of actually sourcing your mud yourself. Go out to a tidal estuary or a riverbank. Just go and look for a muddy area, basically, and just go and poke it. And, does it have a good plasticity and cohesion? So the mud we have behind us here, I've actually sourced this myself up in Coromandel. A friend had a private property that was actually had a bit of mangroves on it. So all the mangroves you have in my tank as well, that's all actually native, New Zealand native ones. I managed to slowly over years acclimatize to a warmer condition, because this species you do get in Australia as well. So I was hoping that some of the genetics could tolerate water at warmer temperature. So with collecting mud yourself, there's always the risk of introducing stuff in the mud you don't want to have. Parasites, diseases, predators that could actually eat potential mudskippers or damage them. So you could then you can prep your mud by either baking it in the oven on a nice tray, like a mud cake, Don't eat that kind of mud cake. But, yeah, so you can bake your mud in the oven, 100 degree for a couple of hours or so, or you can add hydroperoxide to it. Basically, that will kill anything in the mud, basically making all completely sterile as well. So you add that to the mud, and it will start bubbling and killing off anything that's alive in it. If you want to create a more complete biological setup with invertebrates, helping to break down any organic compartments, leftover food, things like that, you can try to stick with just sourcing your mud and basically do nothing. This is what we've done here. We basically, before the Mudskippers went in here, we first basically just observed it ourselves to see what was in here, what was in this mud, because we just collected from the mud, put it straight in the tank. And of course, a lot of stuff showed up. Crabs, snails, bristle worms, which are natural diet for these guys. But anyway, was there anything that, could be a problem? So first, we actually ran this tank more or less on a high tide at the whole time. And we actually had a couple of test guppies in here to see if something would actually go for them. But they survived, started breeding, no diseases, nothing. Anything that was left over or died, a leaf or a branch, it just mulches down, become nothing, and then mud again. And then after having guppies for a while in here, we decided to go with a bumblebee goby, being a goby, like Mudskippers. And we had 6 of them in here for several years. There's actually, funny enough, one still in here. He hasn't gotten eaten yet, but we saw him the other day. And totally fine as well. They grow really well, beautiful coloration. Started burrowing as well. Not burrowing, but finding small hollow areas where they could potentially breed in as well. But yeah, then these guys came along with all these test subjects who have never had any issues. And now this tank is fully ecological almost. If you shine a little torch at nighttime down in the mud, you can see some smaller bristle worms and things like that. And I think that's actually added a bit to our natural setup in here. So that's a different way, and that, sure, it involves some risks as well, but yeah, that was
bristle worms creep me out.
Me too.
Yeah. Well, there is some really bad ones out there for sure, but these guys have been very small, and I think actually these guys now have a constant food source in here, and including the fry as well, because there is tiny microscopic stuff floating around here. So we've tried a more kind of bioactive filter system to the whole thing, basically. But it's really cool.
So once again, you've left me with more questions and answers, but we'll quickly run through some more questions. Ethan would like to know, is mud inert, or will it alter parameters in any way, buffering, hardness, etc., etc.?
Yeah, so I don't actually know the word inert, but anyway, sure. I mean, mud has a lot of organic compartments, right? So it will make the water softer. And for Mudskippers, you do want to have slightly more a pH and all that on a kind of more upper scale still. But saying that, they're also very tolerant to changing environments. But if you're having too soft water, you can add different things to kind of keep the hardness up still. So in our sump, for example, the whole sump, 2/3 of the sump is basically old coral blocks like this to kind of help water a little bit harder. And then you can actually add add pH buffers and those kind of things to it as well. Okay. If you still think it's too soft, and but otherwise it shouldn't be too much. Yeah, they're basically found in such a wide range of environments that it's changing depending on how water comes in and out, and a bit of fighting. Yeah.
So another question we've got is, where specifically in India do the Indian Mudskippers live? So
Pierce's Mudskipper can be found in place of India, but also ranges down to Thailand and Malaysia, I think, as well. In India, I think the species have been found roughly from the far south and maybe a little bit west of that, but either, I don't know all the geographical names of localities here, but from halfway down the west coast of India down towards the east coast, and then ranging down towards Southeast Asia. So it's not just specifically in India if you're looking at the Indian mudskipper or Pierce's mudskipper. So yeah, again, Indian mudskipper, just a trade name for one species, basically.
Cool. And I think we've briefly touched on this, but can you keep them in similar conditions to semi-aquatic crabs?
Yeah. So I've fiddler crabs, for example, is the same kind of environment for those guys, which do great in kind of, they will help as a part of that, actually, ecological point of view. They will pick up food scraps, leftovers, and things like that. But yeah, if you can get some crabs working together, I've tried, for example, red claw crabs back home. Doesn't work. Mudskippers are usually way too aggressive, and if you try to downsize and have a smaller species mudskipper with the crab goes for the mudskipper instead. So you have to trial a little bit, but try to find a non-aggressive crab species. But then also make sure everybody has their space. Make sure that the crab, you meet all the criteria and requirements of what the crab needs versus the mudskipper.
Cool. Yeah.
So just make sure all animals are happy.
Yeah. And I suppose the bigger aquarium, the easier that'll be.
Yeah.
I've got several questions that I've written down as you've been talking. You mentioned potentially bringing predators in if you're collecting your own mud. What natural predators do they have?
So the natural predators for these guys, so they've managed to avoid most of the fish, right? The fish predators, larger fish, by living on land. This is probably one of the reasons why they there's a whole new food source ecosystem for them to explore. But fish will eat them, but otherwise, animals that live on land. So snakes, the dog-faced snake, for example, is a species that seems to specialize in mudskippers in the mangroves of Southeast Asia. Lots of aquatic birds, seabirds, wetland birds, so herons, terns, those kind of things, and crabs. Crabs will definitely will also go for mudskippers, and of course humans, if you want to put that part as well. They are eaten in some parts of the world. In Malaysia, for example, they can sometimes be eaten raw as a sexual aphrodisiac. But in other parts, they actually make them into some nice. It's very common to find them in soups.
Mudskipper soup.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's probably the most common question I get as well. Would you eat the mudskipper if somebody serves it to you? But, if somebody serves me food, I don't want to be rude. I would probably eat it for sure.
I suppose that's like some of these guys that we've had on who go over to South America and they eat plecos.
Yeah.
They eat that on the side of the Amazon, don't they? So
humans in the terms of for food, and I think in India as well, some part of a festive season as well, and high tide, not a high tide, but like a quite during certain festivals, they will eat them as well. But then it's also in danger from being a predator, over harvested for the pet trade, and then of course pollution and habitat degradation, and that's happening all over the place. We've lost so much mangroves for shrimp farming and for development and different things. But yeah, that's kind of set aside. That's more into conservation, mudskipper conservation. But natural predators: birds, crabs, fish, lizards. I've seen monitors in Thailand basically going for mudskippers and things, so it's pretty cool.
Wow, cool. I've also would like to know, you mentioned the substrate depth earlier.
Yep.
What depth is your substrate? You've got 180 liters of it, so it must be a decent.
Yeah. So you kind of, if you want mudskippers to be able to burrow and do it safely, you need to have a thick layer of mud, and also to make those burrows if you want to ever try to encourage breeding. So I would say the minimum depth depends on the species a little bit. If you have a smaller species, but the minimum depth I would say is 15 centimeters. And then you can just go as deep as you want. My tank here is roughly about 18 in the front, and it's coming up to about 30 in the far back.
Wow.
But some of these species, they can burrow down to 2 meters.
Wow.
Yeah. So
That's really impressive.
Yes, these are some of the that kind of go down the way when the tide comes out or comes in.
Yeah. So the air. So different species have also different kind of underground chambers, several exits in some cases as well. So it's different species, different kind of genus, and different kind of burrows. And in some cases, we don't actually know what the burrow looks in some cases for some species because they've never been observed really.
Wow, cool, crazy.
But yeah, it's a deep layer. That's what you want.
What are you using filtration-wise for your aquarium in particular? If you've got the drain system going, how's your filtration work for that?
So this is the cool part with Mudskippers. You don't actually need a filtration system if you have mud as a substrate. The mud will actually act as that biofilter. So in this case, this water is just going around and around, being filtered naturally with what's in here, and all our water perimeters are beautiful. I do have a small filter saying that at the bottom sump that basically just collects the bigger particles, just so I don't get too much of sedimentation and thing build up at the bottom sump, which means I need to clean it up more often before stuff gets clogged. This is a little bit of a problem when you're dealing with muds and pumps because it's such a fine sediment. So you might actually burn out your pumps slightly faster than if you just have pure crystal clear water, basically. But that's not what you having Mudskippers and crystal clear water. It's not a thing. It's like you can't get that if you want to make sure you have a healthy setup for your Mudskipper. You want basically the muddy murkiness. I mean, this water is actually quite clear until they start moving around. Then they just stir up all that mud, but that sinks down somewhat fast as well. But this is quite, this water is also quite yellow because of all the organic compartments in the mud as well. The tannins and things like that.
What water conditions are you keeping them in? Salinity level, that kind of stuff. Where does that go? Do you allow it to range, or you're pretty solid on where it sits?
No, so I allow mine to actually range a little bit. So I will, for example, if I a little bit mimic that we're having a lot of weather influxes and things like that, I will actually raise my salinity a little bit at the same time as I'm actually doing a lot of spraying water, trying to increase more humidity in the tank. But so Mudskippers are really adaptive to a changing environment. Living on a tidal mudflat, your environment changes constantly. Your salinity, your fresh versus brackish water, salt water, wind, temperatures. So they are one of the most adaptive animals in the world. They can live in such a high ammonia level that would kill most other fish. So they've evolved all these really amazing systems on how to cope with that. So for example, Mudskippers, they actually breed with their skin. 70% is roughly skin breeding. And that's why they need to keep damp as well. But yeah, so ideally, even though some species can be found in almost freshwater, near freshwater, or freshwater at times, I usually say if you have your salinity ranging around 0.5 pp around there, like quite low end brackish around there, that's good. You don't have to be spot on the whole time. You can easily go up and down a little bit, but between 5 and 0.5 and 0.10 around, I think is good.
Cool.
But then you can go up a little higher if you are suspecting that you might have disease or fungi or something. Just increase your salinity a little bit in the water as well. But having a bit of salt does add to all better welfare as well. If you're keeping a Mudskipper in fresh water for too long, it will start affecting its immune system as well.
Yeah.
Over time, especially if it's stressed, you have too many fish, too much aggression, constantly being chased, wrong diet.
Yeah. So obviously these are they've been in New Zealand for some time, but there's been a recent influx of Mudskippers making their way into New Zealand. I haven't paid too much attention, other than there's been more people very interested in them. Are shops promoting them as like a semi-brackish type fish or fully freshwater? Like, have you seen how they're being promoted and advertised? This is just out of my own curiosity because I haven't paid much attention.
No, it's very interesting. So I think there's been even seeing online what's going on and all that stuff. There's been suddenly a lot of like TikTok videos, look at the cute little Mudskipper here and there. And of course, see so many people just buying fish without actually knowing how to meet their welfare requirements. And I've seen shops as well, like freshwater Mudskipper. It's like, there's not really much of a thing. You can find them in freshwater at times, or near freshwater. I mean, and rocky foreshores and those kind of habitats. But like, you will also see me, for example, in a pizzeria. It doesn't mean I actually live there. I just happened to be there at that time, in a way. But there's definitely a lot of misinformation out there in terms of how to look after these guys. So yeah, they can be in freshwater for some time, quite some long time. And when I say long time, several months, but over time, it's slowly a stressful factor still. But yeah, putting them in fresh water, it's constant seeing them in too much water, the wrong substrate. So for example, the way Mudskippers feed, if you put them on gravel, they can't actually feed that well from a gravel substrate because they use water as a hydraulic tongue to suck in water. So as they're basically seeing a little bug on a piece of, let's say this is, definitely read this, by the way. This is probably the best book you can get. It's called Fishes Out of Water. And it's basically all the science papers that's been written, basically put in together to a book. Really, really helpful. If you want to get Mudskippers, I recommend this book, definitely. But if you basically have a little Mudskipper seeing food, a little bug, insects, for example, a lot of food is insect after a certain life stage, they basically put their mouth over the insect or food piece and then uses water to kind of over it, but then they're sucking the water in again and they're sucking in the food into their mouth. So if you have them on the wrong kind of substrate where the water is, let's say you have gravel, or I mean, I've even seen people keeping these on moss. It's like the moss, the water just goes all over the place and they can't get that food properly. So they will struggle swallowing. But so that's why you want a substrate or an interior stuff like driftwood, where you can easily get that water sucked back into their mouth and their guts. So yeah, there's a lot of like, and of course in the shops, like I used to work in a pet shop when I was younger, and I remember our manager would say, when we're taking in the fish, it shouldn't be longer than a week in the shop, right? So therefore, setting up a system like this, that's not going to work in a pet shop, because we need to have a rotation of animals and fish, and all the setup needs to be, meeting all the fish basically. So yeah, people have a tendency then of putting the Mudskippers on the wrong kind of habitat in the shop. But of course, as a person who don't know that much about these guys and they find them very cute and don't do their research before purchasing them, they think that setup they see in the pet shop is okay. And sure, that is okay for a week or 2 or 3 maybe.
Yeah.
But
you're never going to get the best out of them in that kind of setup.
No.
You're just going to see it.
So you basically want Mudskipper setup should be 2/3 land, water ideally not deeper, if unless you have a tidal. But if you don't have a tidal, then you shouldn't have water that's deeper than the Mudskipper is long, but ideally not deeper than what the fish is high, because it always wants to be able to have the eyes above water. And if they have lower water, the way to keep the damp is basically they twist and roll in the mud. That's the way to keep them damp and roll. It's like a little mud roll.
So how is it to breathe outside of the water? You mentioned, how do they breathe outside of water? You mentioned that they breathe through their skin. How does that work?
So I mean, that is quite detailed how, you know, it's in this book. I can't really explain exactly how it works with skin breeding, but they need to basically have that environment where you have high humidity and
Right.
temperature to be able to breed properly. If you're keeping a mudskipper in too much water, or let's say, for example, you have a setup where you don't have enough land and you have too many mudskippers and there's always a bit constant bullying and one guy isn't allowed to actually get up off the water and fully get up on land, you will over time screw up the osmosis and the salinity levels or something like that in his body, and they will slowly internally kind of drown because they can't. They need to be able to get up there and then have that, like, you know. But if you've always been bullied, so you're always in the water, well, you can't properly breathe through your skin then.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, you can do the regular little bit of air breathing as other fish as well. But the majority of breathing or getting oxygen to your blood is through the skin. And this is actually quite recent research as well, or, you know, discoveries as well. I think there's some older research that back in the day, you would always quite often see a mudskipper sitting with its tail in the water. And there was some early thoughts that mudskippers were breathing through their tails, for example. But that's a long time ago, but it's still interesting.
Yeah, it is really. It's fascinating.
Yeah. But yeah, we're constantly discovering new things, and we still don't know how some of these species breed. We're still finding new species. There's a new species in the trade at the moment, which hasn't been described yet. That just started showing up, which I think people managed to track down that the original source is somewhere around Indonesia or Jakarta, down there, which is really interesting.
Wow.
So yeah, it's and then of course misidentification as well in the shops selling what they think. Well, quite often you just see Mudskipper, but there is roughly 19 different species in 3 genera, so it's quite different. You know, some more aquatic than others, some filter feeding versus actively hunting insects and crabs and, you know, bristleworms.
Yeah, wow.
So it's good for shops to kind of do their research before selling things as well.
Definitely.
Sadly.
So you keep a small group of the species that you've got. You've got like a larger group. Do you notice a hierarchy within the group?
So so in New Zealand currently, the only species we can get that's allowed into the country is Perithalamus barbarus, the West Atlantic species. Sadly, it's one of the larger species, which means you're going to have to work with the size of your tank. It's also one of the more aggressive species and also one of the more endangered species in the wild due to over harvesting and pollution, basically. And they have disappeared from a lot of places where they usually used to be. And this tank behind me is going to be too small at some stage, or we're going to have to move 1 or 2. But yes, we have 3 in here. When we got them back in June, they were only 5-6 centimeters long. They're already coming up to 10 now. So in June, July, August, 3 months. So growing really quickly. So it's going to be interesting to see how it's going to progress from here. So we're still learning and discovering things. So it's a bit of a test experiment in a way. So what we're seeing here is we have a dominant one in the middle of the tank. And this tank is built up with a lot of like visual barriers, and they can kind of, as they're potentially chasing each other around, they can take different turns and just disappear behind things to get it out of each other's sight. But yeah, we have one that's very dominant, looks after the middle area, the burrow, where we actually had the breeding going on. And then we have basically the other 2 that are on either side of the tank. And mostly they stay out of their sight unless they see me, for example, because then they get very excited as well. And it's like, oh, maybe there's food involved or something. And then they will start entering each other's little territory and start interacting with each other. But they're not really that actively seeking out each other in here. But we definitely see we have what we call, we haven't named them or anything. We just call them 1, 2, 3 at the moment. 1 being the dominant and 3 the least dominant. But it is interesting saying that, because the dominances seem to swap between 2 and 3 every now and then. They're always, except with number 1, where we saw that courtshipping. So that was number 2 suddenly courtshipping with number 1. It's really hard to tell. You can't really tell the sexes apart in most species. In some species, you can really easily tell apart because the first dorsal fin is near absent in the females, while in the males, really big and beautiful. But in this species, for example, you can't really tell apart unless you really have them next to each other, fin raised out. The fin base in the males, the fin base in the first dorsal fin is longer in the male than the female, but you can't see that unless both having their fins like that next to each other. And then, of course, you have to look at the genitalial area as well. And even that is really difficult because they look so similar to each other unless they are in reproductive, like breeding mode, and they're quite active. Then they will swell up a little bit and you can't tell them apart. But then you basically have to have them up your glass like that, so you can actually see a good view of their openings.
Cool. I was going to ask you if there's any sexual dimorphoses between them, but cool.
Yeah, easy in some species, others really, really difficult.
Yeah. The last thing that I would like to know that I've written down so far is what are you planning on feeding the fry?
Yeah, so this is a good question because we've never really had fry of this species before, right? But in those other cases, there's basically been live rotifiers. That's how you say it, right? Rotifers. Yeah, but because Mudskipper fry, they are basically planktonic, right? So they have to drift with currents and eat what comes across them, basically. So small, microscopic planktonic live algae or like crustaceans, because they're so small. Yeah, well, it's just a green soup of algae, basically.
Yeah.
You could try Infusoria if you can get that.
Yeah, that's. I think that's been trialed in 1 or 2 cases as well. I think in this species they're a little bit larger than the other fry of some species that has been bred. But yeah, that could definitely work as well, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting as well because I mean, this is just my regular computer room. I don't have a whole aquatic setup workshop, you know. If I had that, I would totally just
geek out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Cool. We've had another question from the comments, and then we'll get back onto our structured questions, which I might add. Normally at this point, we're about halfway through, and we've had 2 questions that we've written down already. So we're going well so far.
Cool.
William would like to know what size is the tank behind you and how many Mudskippers would you max do in that size, or maybe for a new person to start, what size would be the bare minimum?
All right. So the tank behind me here, the dimensions is basically 90, I think it was 95 on the sides, and then it's 55, 56, 55 basically. So that's around I think that tank itself is around 304. There's no more actually. I can't even remember the numbers here. But so basically, because you're not utilizing as much space because Mudskipper is living on it's a floor species, right? And it totally depends on the species as well. So if you're a beginner, I would totally go for one of the mid-sized species. The smaller species can be a little bit picky. So, for example, the Pierce's Mudskipper or Indian Mudskipper, I prefer to use the other name, Pierce's Mudskipper. They can be a little bit picky with the food because they're so small, and it can be difficult finding good food sources fitting a small Mudskipper, like that. I would recommend probably Paraphthalmodon septembradiatus. That is the ant-eating one I mentioned before. Quite aggressive, but it's a good new beginner's Mudskipper if you could trial with 1, maybe 2 individuals in a good sized tank. I I successfully kept 5 in a 800-liter tank. That was roughly dimensions 180 centimeters, 60 and 70 high. And that was enough to have their own space with the barriers of lots of driftwood so they can hide and things. But you could quite easily keep 1, and I wouldn't go under 120 liter if you're looking at a 10 centimeter Mudskipper. If you go for a 6 centimeter one, you could probably go down to 100 centimeters, like a 100-liter tank. For 1, 2, 3 of the Pierce's Mudskipper, if you have a lot of visual barriers. But if you want to have one that's not too picky with the food, it's very active. September radiatus is a good species, and you could easily have one in a 150-liter tank because they're quite active. They do move around a lot if you meet all the requirements and temperatures that they need. Does that make sense? Yeah. I'm
naturally assuming that this is where footprint becomes quite important for these animals, like the length and the width.
Yeah,
it's significantly more important than the overall volume. Like you could do a 20-foot by 5-foot sort of thing, but only yay high, and be really comfortable with them. I don't know what those maths would work out to be numbers wise, but that would be a significantly bigger than big, massive volume based aquarium.
Yeah, the more floor space you can get, the better. And height as well. I mean, the height is also really good because it's going to mean that you can if you have a tank that's lower, you can more easily heat that up as well.
Yeah, true.
Because if you have your heat lamps way up here, it's going to be harder to reach those nice warming temperatures down at the ground level. You want your high temperature in the air, your high humidity as well. Your humidity should be somewhere between 70, 75 to up to 90.
So do you think, say, for example, the ant-eating species, if you had like a high aquarium set up, could you, and obviously it was sealed properly, could you have ants living in the flora that's grown on the back of the aquarium? Could you have that type of setup? Or would that
My wife says no straight away.
Sorry?
I said my wife says no straight away.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, mine too.
Yeah, I mean, they're quite specific with the genus of the ants they're eating, it seems. But I mean, I would feed my small black ants and ant eggs. That's what I fed out to mine. But with that, what you want to have in your setup, not just flat, ideally, you would actually want to have a gradient slope of like a 30-degree slope in the tank.
Right.
And because that seems to be one of those kind of points that triggers them to burrow as well. That they have that kind of thing. And quite often they will burrow up to something in their environment. So you basically have, this log here, and then there will be a hole next to it, so it gets them started. Saying that, though, one of these guys just made a hole in the very middle of the tank, just in the very, just straight down. We weren't sure first that those burrows were connected, but then suddenly we went into one burrow and we saw the water fluctuating at the bottom of that hole suddenly on the other one. So suddenly we knew this, and then they started making those air bubbles, and bubbles went down there, but the air bubbles came up in a different hole. So it's like different.
A little network.
I mean, you could have definitely, creating a more living environment for these guys, and you could. I wouldn't put in as tank mates, but you can definitely have, put in a few small live bugs so they get interested, get to hunt. I mean, that adds to the whole environmental enrichment side. I'm thinking
maybe wingless fruit flies or something like that.
Yeah. Fruit flies is actually, so talking diets, fruit flies, great food source for even picky mudskippers because they're so small. It as soon as your muds get exposed, during low tide, there's all these flies coming and feeding on things, dead algae and crustaceans and whatever. So of course, fruit flies probably is quite similar to what they would find en masses in the wild as well. But yeah, fruit flies, good food source. Moth small insects, smaller crickets as well. Great. I mean, mudskippers, they're not picky. They will go for anything that moves, basically. Small fish as well. They will definitely go for that as well, which is also a good food source for bigger mudskippers and a part of their natural diet. Small shrimps. I feed these guys with small live crabs, small live shrimps, but even smaller fried, smaller, the smaller gammas, shrimps, these are freeze dried, but I put them in water so they get to really soften up before feeding them as well. But these guys get a quite wide range of different food because, mudskippers can become very, what's the word? They're basically just eating one thing because that's all they've been given, and then they won't try anything new. But if you constantly try new things, if they're being picky, maybe starve them for a little bit more, add something else that might be interested. They have a really good sense of smell, so they can smell stuff as well. But I give these guys a wide range of live food, moss, small crabs, shrimps, fruit flies, even house flies.
So when you say small crabs, what are we talking? Are we talking like the little tiny crabs that you get? The Thailand ones, the Thai.
Yeah, so for this size currently now, I wouldn't feed a crab out that's larger than a centimeter. But that depends on your size of your fish as well. I mean, the biggest mudskippers, they grow up to 25 centimeters.
Oof.
So, and those can even draw blood if they bite you. So but there's also a wide range, on the market of frozen food as well to feed out. So just, properly defrost. I wouldn't put in a frozen block of, mysis shrimps or anything like that, but defrost them. I took a few. I'm not going to do any branding of things, but black mosquito larvae, microplanktons, mysis, tubifex larvae, red worms, all those different things, and just constantly do different food, different day, because in the wild they're encountering so much different things to eat.
So how do you feed the frozen food out? Obviously, you've defrosted it. Does it sit on just put it on a little piece of the substrate and they come and chomp it off that, or drop a bit in the water and it kind of fluctuates for them?
Yeah, so I do different things as well, just to make their day as different and enriching as well. So depending on what I'm feeding out, and if I want to get a closer look at something, you can either you can just hand feed if they're really comfortable with that. One of these guys is comfortable hand feeding. The other one doesn't hand feed that well. Mostly when I put my hold down, he will just venture away. But those kind of metallic tweezers, longer ones, that works really well to food out. But then also I will actually just where is that? I will basically just defrost all of those things into a little cup like that, and I will just pour it in different places in the whole tank. And so every now and then, sorry.
Would you say, do they eat mud sometimes as well and expel it through their gills, or? Yeah.
So they will basically do that little bit of filter feeding and sucking up, putting out stuff as well that way, in a way. So you can basically pour it out. Sometimes I actually usually most of the feeding is, of course, when it's low tide. So I never feed during high tide unless there's a few live bugs that suddenly have been hiding sometime and then suddenly water comes through and they're like, no, and they start running out. That's when they get eaten, basically. Or if I accidentally catch a fly or something like that on the go and it's high tide, I'll just chuck it down as well. And usually during high tide, nothing happens. They just find a little spot and there's no aggression or anything. Oh, hang on. I need to charge my computer.
He's doing a me.
Yeah. So, and in some cases, just to make it a little bit interesting as well, I pour a little bit of food just on top of the outlet of the pump. So suddenly when it goes high tide water, it just splashes food all over the place. But it takes at least, a couple of minutes before that water to fully raise to the height. So they have a little bit of time feeding suddenly when water starts moving around.
Sure.
So when you're handling, do you have to wear... Sorry, you go, Karen.
I just said I found that incredibly fascinating. I've been wondering what you're using because we've discussed the food already to it a little bit, but how you go through that whole process. That's really cool.
Yeah. So I try to make it as natural as possible as well, in a way, But hand feeding is kind of good if you want to get closer to like get a closer view of the fish. If you need, like, is something going on? Is there swelling somewhere, or do you have a little bit of a fungal issue or something to make sure you can get a closer look, to make it having the fish being comfortable with you. So it has
when you're hand feeding, do you need to wear gloves or anything in case the salts in your hand damage them?
Yeah, I try to always, well, I'm not wearing gloves, but I try to always make sure that I have really clean hands, and I've washed them, that I haven't put on any moisturizer or anything like that beforehand and then feeding them out. But usually you hold your food and they go like, that's it. That's so quickly. But yeah, ideally no hand holding. I've seen people sitting and petting their Mudskippers like that, and I was like, nah, you're ruining their skin, basically, their natural protective mucus layer, in a way. Yeah.
Okay.
I just had a question. Oh, the crypt that I sent up to you a few months back, is that gone into that tank?
It did.
How did it go?
Make it. It didn't make it, which is it started growing, and I kept getting new shoots, bigger leaves, but then they started actually wilting back a little bit, and I couldn't really figure out what was going on. And then in here, because it is a biological system, there's also Malaysian trumpet snails in here, and they really tried to feed it as well. So there was like, I had it in a separate terracotta pot in the tank, when then basically were so there was a little bit of water in it. I was slowly trying to acclimatize it to actually be in that damper environment. And it was growing, but I couldn't figure out what was going on there, why it started drying, because it was growing really well, and it actually tripled in height, basically. But then it just started growing. So it's almost like it wasn't humid enough, which is weird, because the humidity in here is 80%. So, yeah.
So were you growing it immersed?
Sorry?
Were you growing it immersed out of the water, or was it taking the fluctuations of the water?
No, it was basically, to begin with, it was basically more or less submerged, and I slowly, over time, basically made the water lower and lower. And I also tried to actually, in the very beginning, first have a small little plastic bag to really make sure that was actually really humid as well. So yeah, sadly that didn't work for that plant, which really gutted me as well, because it's such I've seen tanks with them really big as well, on a zoo level as well, and it would be really great. I've seen them in the wild as well, which is
cool.
Yeah. If you do have any other, I'd like to give it another try. But
we're talking about Cryptsealata, which I've had for a very long time. And at this point, I think I've only got 3 plants. I've only grown them submersed. And because you've just said that you got a really good growth response of it growing immersed, I haven't wanted to trial taking it out of water, because I haven't wanted to kill it, because I don't think I've got enough stock to kind of allow that. But I might have a wee play around with that. So
how deep, like, could you just lower the water table so the plant starts actually being almost forced to grow outside?
If I took the fish out, yes.
You have fish there as well.
Yeah, that would probably be the way that I would do it. It's also full of Aponogetons, which can't grow immersed in that tank as well. So the tank they're in won't allow that. But yeah, if I was, I think previously when I played around converting, I've just allowed the water to naturally do its own thing and dry out, and the plants seem to have responded much better than physically taking them out straight away and then planting them and then drying them off and that kind of stuff. So yeah, that would be the way that I'd do it, just allow it to naturally evaporate in time.
Yeah, and it was very odd, because it was starting to grow really well, and I think the largest leaves we were getting, they were quite like that size. Oh, that's hard to see on there. Yeah. But yeah, and then they started like almost drying in at the edges, almost like it wasn't humid enough. But maybe because there's heat lamps in here as well. Maybe the heat lamps are actually too like deep heat on it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I've recently, well, maybe a few months ago, transferred one that I had to another tank that I was doing with pea puffers, and it's responded the best out of any movement I've ever done with it, and it's got a bit of peat underneath it, slightly black water, nothing too much, but it's definitely responded the best out of any time I've transported them. So that I thought was quite a little bit reassuring for me as well. And I digress. We're totally off topic now, so I'm sorry to everyone that was watching.
I mean, it's actually part of how do we set up a good environment for these guys, and having live plants definitely help, with uptakes of, too much nutrients in the mud as well. It's just a part of the whole natural ecosystem,
Yeah.
And having mangroves in your tanks, if you can get mangroves, definitely do it, because it will basically benefit with your water quality and uptake of, nitrates and ammonia and that kind of stuff.
Have you ever set up or used macroalgae with it being brackish? Is that something that you've seen before? Or way off?
Not really. I'm trying to remember if I've come across that. I bet you there's somebody out there probably doing it, but yeah, I've never seen it, but I don't see why not. But that depends on how low, what level of salinity you would be at, right?
Mm-hmm. So what kind of level of salinity do you sit at then?
So, mine is kind of ranging a little bit, but if you want to have it at, if you want to be somewhere between 0.5 or 0.10, basically.
Right.
But you can go a little bit higher up as well. But of course, knowing your species as well, because some mudskippers are found closer to the ocean, so they can probably deal with higher salinity and even full marine at times. Just at times, not for constant. I've seen people keeping them at full marine as well, but they don't last that long.
So 1.025.
Yeah.
For full
No,
marine,
hang on. Yeah. 0.25. Yeah.
There's obviously been a recent interest in New Zealand for the Mudskippers. What do you think has sort of brought that upon? Is it just because they've been brought into the country again after a long time and people are, oh, saying you? Or do you think there's another wee driving force behind the interest of them at the moment?
Maybe because I moved here and there was no Mudskippers, I started asking around. I don't know. So I mean, I was trying to figure out last time they were here, and I found some old chat groups from like 2012 and around there from like, I think it was called like Fish World or something like that, a chat group or a website or something.
Aquarium?
Yeah.
Yep. Aquarium. Yep.
But I reckon there is a few videos going around on TikTok actually posting a lot of stuff constantly, but also like when I suddenly kind of realized that wow, you could actually get Mudskippers into New Zealand as well. I didn't think that was possible to begin with, and of course I was only here for a few years to begin with. But then when I was like, I'm gonna get Mudskippers again, then I started really asking around importers and people and everything. So, and then then COVID happened, and then of course nothing happened. But I just kept asking, and then we built this still thinking, okay, we'll see what happens if it ever happens. And if Mudskippers weren't gonna come into New Zealand, well, I had a really cool tidal tank still that could be useful for other fish or other creatures. But yeah, I think it's social media, and then somebody just like probably saw Mudskippers on an import list or something and just decided to take in a good number. I don't know. I've heard that there's like about 100 Mudskippers in New Zealand now, and it would be really good to know who has what.
Cool. Yeah.
Just so we can kind of keep it as our own little community. I mean, I know a couple of people who's gotten them, whose friends are friends and similar. But yeah, it's very interesting. And
I think it's one of those kind of species that it captivates your attention instantly because of their appearance. you can't help but be fascinated by them.
Yeah.
And on social media, if you're scrolling through and then you see that, you're like, oh, what's that? And then boom.
Yeah, I mean, I quite often get people sending me links, friends who's like, "Hey, look, a Mudskipper. This is for you. You're the Mudskipper guy." So if regular people who doesn't even have aquariums see these kind of videos, of course it's going to showcase in some interest. And maybe it's like, and the most common thing I hear, well, because like for example, I oversee some of those people who. Every time a new member goes to the Mudskipper group, you can answer some questions. And what's your interest in Mudskippers? Do you have Mudskippers? And I think the most common thing I see is actually they're cute. And
to be fair, they are pretty cute.
Oh, they are adorable. Yeah, and I mean with that as well, they're as we talked about Ren and Stimpy show. So you have the Muddy Mudskipper guy there. And then there's the Aquanauts, right? I think there was a Mudskipper on that show as well.
Yeah, there was.
Yeah. And I wonder if there's also a Mudskipper-looking guy on, what's his name? SquarePants? Bob?
Bob I think a lot of the fish look like Mudskippers.
I haven't watched that, but yeah.
That one.
Yeah. And I mean, it's just so, and like in some places like Japan, they're really popular in terms of just as a figure. Like you can buy Hello Kitty figures with Mudskipper dresses, and keychains and things. I think I do have years ago I came across this little keychain from Japan showing one of those filters feeding Mudskippers. It's been with me for like 20 years now, so it's pretty worn down. But
cool.
Yeah, and they had all ranges of colors, and this is sadly the only one I've left. And they're quite a comic. I'm not going to go into too much of like models and stuff, but like my husband, we got together on our first date. He said, "Hey, I'd like to see your Mudskippers." I was like, "Yeah, sure." And then took him home. We got to see my Mudskippers, and then eventually he kind of made this really cool sketch of a comic-looking Mudskipper that I actually made a model of a couple of years later. So like looking like this is basically being my husband, being Mudskippers. But yeah, it's just really. They're just really funny guys, and like I said, they're really active. There's always stuff going on, and yeah. But there's definitely a lot of. If you want to keep Mudskippers, I definitely recommend do your homework first. Do your homework first. Have your tank set up, and have it running for a while. Then get your Mudskippers.
Yeah, Stephen's just said that's the best pickup line ever. Come home and see my Mudskippers.
It works. Not bad. We've been together for like 18 years now.
That's not bad. I can, as you've been describing them, you can totally understand how there's like a comical vibe to them or a cartoony type vibe to them, which could get that appeal out a little bit more into the real world, so to speak. Just the way that they act, behave, and look, you can totally see how that is. Even the fact that you can sit them on a rock and make them into a model, which model fish or toy fish don't kind of have that ability to do because they don't sit on stuff like that. Yeah. So like, there's a lot of weird dynamics going for them, for sure. Yeah.
So yeah, it's
kind of remind me a lot of Watchmen Goby that I had.
Yeah.
And they just sit on top of things and watch everything that goes on. And
I mean, they are gobies, so which is you get so many kinds of gobies, in the world, and then you have the comb tooth, the blanids as well.
Blanids, yeah.
And they are actually some of those species you can actually find on land as well. And I think currently, if you're looking at the amount of different fish genera and species, I think there's about 30 different fish that can actually be on land at periods or at times, So fish is definitely trying to get back up on land again. Who knows? Maybe in the future become new land animals as well, if they just keep evolving. But yeah, and that's also like a lot of people like, hey, check out these Mudskippers. And it's like, yeah, they're actually not Mudskippers, they're blanids, but they're up on land on those rocky foreshores, sitting there in that wave zone where they get splashed. If you go to Niue, for example, or Fiji, you can see them on the rocky coast just sitting there and grazing on algae but above the water. But not Mudskippers, but really cool.
Oh, I just saw one dart across your aquarium.
Yeah.
What's the typical lifespan of the animals?
Well, we reckon somewhere between 6, 7, up to 15, depending on the species.
Yeah. That's a fairly good innings for them.
Yeah, but definitely at least 6 years for the smaller species. Yeah. Cool. Anything that's shorter than 6 years, I would say, then there's something going on,
How old do you think the ones that have recently brought into New Zealand were? Because you said you had those ones since June and they've already reproduced. That's quite a small window. I would have thought that the sexual maturity age would be, a couple of years. Sort of animal that they are.
I'm a bit surprised. I mean, there's probably some papers on that as well. I reckon the ones that came into the country here based on this speed growth. I mean, Mudskippers are always wild caught. Basically, that's in the trade. So there's no captive bred ones that are in the trade. They're all wild caught, right? Because there's been so rare instances of people who's managed to breed them. I would say based on that being 5 centimeters, I would probably say they're about a year and a half, maybe. A year. Yeah.
So me thinking a couple of years for sexual maturity would be kind of in that. Ballpark figure numbers. Yeah.
I mean, maybe these guys are growing so fast and well because they're getting prime care, good range of food, very nutritious food, so maybe we're speeding up the growth a little bit by keep them in captive care. That's a good question. But based on the ones that arrived here, I mean, these guys they were actually in very poor condition when I got them, even sadly. And I mean, this guy wild caught West Africa, and then having to be shipped to somewhere, right, for an importer to even buy them. I don't think they bought them straight from out of Africa. They probably. You probably know a bit better where some of these aquarium fish in New Zealand are arriving from, if it's Singapore or Bangkok or Thailand, maybe.
I think a lot come from Singapore, yeah.
Yes, I wouldn't be surprised. Basically, go wild caught in Africa, then shipped over to Singapore, sitting in Singapore for what? Under the wrong condition. I'm really afraid of guessing the number, how many have perished on this route to even get here. Because then there's a month in quarantine in New Zealand as well.
Correct.
So, and if you squeeze in 100 Mudskipper in a 100-liter tank with too much water and a floating device, most of them are just going to drown and perish off. One of these guys was basically missing one of his pectoral fin, that just grew back out. And there was a big burnt scar looking almost like there was too much ammonia levels in the water still, which would have probably killed most other fish in a way. That was an interesting call. Somebody just did a big smack it out. So I think definitely if even importers and people keeping it in quarantine could meet some more of their requirement, you will probably have a higher number surviving while transporting them. And then even transporting in the bag, you have one fish per bag, and you should only have like a centimeter or two of water at the very bottom, and then extra oxygen.
Yeah. In the wild, are they on any red lists or anything like that, or is there a plentiful supply at the moment of different species? Obviously.
Well, the bigger species, barbarous, have disappeared in places in the wild because of probably over harvesting. But it's still concerned as a least concern if you're looking at its conservation status. I think actually pretty much all Mudskippers are probably on the least concern still, because it's just not enough research on their status. But I have heard that they have disappeared in other places of like India as well. And they're basically, like the canary in the gold mine as well. They can survive to a very tolerant stage of environment shifting, but eventually if Mudskippers are dying off, something is really bad,
when you first said they're of least concern, my first thought was, that's good, but then you said because it might actually be from lack of data, lack of knowledge, lack of research to actually be proving this, and I thought there's got to be a lot of species of all sorts of stuff, not just fish, that are at that point of, we're not concerned about this because we haven't studied enough of this right now.
Yeah. But yeah, definitely a little bit of over-harvested in places from what I've heard as well.
Yeah.
And that's probably why new species are showing up on the market as well, because we're venturing into new areas where nobody has been before.
Yeah. Very interesting. What are some of the more intriguing behaviors that you've observed while keeping mudskippers?
Well, so there's basically different kind of different behaviors, like different visual behaviors, different kind of fin racing, coloration change. They change colors constantly, which is really cool. But I would say if they're too pale, then it's the wrong kind of habitat in a way, or they're stressed. So you go paler as you're stressed, unless you are really, really also stressed. Then you can go the total opposite and go almost black. But also, some species go really colorful during breeding, especially the male in that ant-eating species, September aureatus. They're probably the most colorful species. Go very bright metallic blue with red dots all over and things. I don't think I have any good pictures of that somewhere easily. But then there's also what they call the snake twirl, which one will just sit and do this with his body for constant time. And then there's the head racing, where you basically just open your mouth and try to, they almost make the head more narrow in some cases and taller, or wider in some other species. And then there's
I always thought that looked a little bit like a velociraptor in Jurassic Park.
Yeah. And you have in one genus where we don't really know what this behavior actually means, but they keep standing up and stand on their tail and then falling down. So they go up and then. So if my hand is the Mudskipper, he goes up several times like that. So if you're on a tidal mudflat in Northern Australia, for example, it's called the Scartaleos Mudskipper. You see this almost eel-looking Mudskipper just standing on its tail in the mud, just several like that all over the place. It's really interesting. Cairns is a good place to see them on the Esplanade during low tide. But that's one of the more aquatic species, so they will always be in the mud that never dries out. So there's lots of fin racing, lots of different movements. Actually, the front cover of the Fishes Out of Water book, you have the gold-spotted Mudskipper basically like really jumping and courtshipping that way. So lots of different behaviors, lots of things, but at times also they're just sitting there and then rolling in the mud if they get to dampen, or they basically suck their eyes down into the orbital eye sockets just to dampening them. And it almost looks like they're flirting with you because they can do one eye at a time as well.
That's interesting. I'm just rolling through our questions that we haven't asked, but the vast majority of these questions we have touched on, which is fantastic.
That's cool.
John, do you have any other questions while I'm just running through what we've got?
Yeah, just while she's were talking, I've discovered that in the UK there's a fish called a shanny, which is not a goby, but it's a blenny type of blenny, and that can actually live outside of the water for in between tides as well, and they look very similar to mudskippers. So I didn't know that. So
there is, bit of convergent evolution. You're all starting to like how are we starting to approach our body look when you're a fish trying to get up on land? For sure. Mudskippers have almost like elbows, and their pectoral fins are actually pointed forward, so they can actually crawl on them. And then if they really need to get away fast, they will basically just tuck in their tail fin basically behind them and then sprint away, which is the same kind of way that blenids actually move as well, only not as coordinated.
Mm-hmm. It's got longer fins as well.
Is there any specific health issues that can occur with them, or some fish are more prone to this? Is there particular things you need to keep your eyes on?
Yeah, so I mean, they're very tolerant to. I don't think I've even heard any cases of like fungal disease or itch on the Mudskipper. But it seems to be gastrointestinal stuff. Definitely, that's the issue. I've seen some cases of bacterial infection is a big thing if you are keeping them under wrong conditions for too long. So and especially then affecting the eyes as well. That could be a thing. That cloudiness of the eyes will basically happen. But yeah, usually they're so tolerant to all these different kind of other diseases that we quite often see in the hobby of aquarium fish. And this is probably because they also live on land, right? More or less. So, parasites can't really be on land for the majority of time in their lifetime, and so there is some intestinal parasites as well, worms. So it's always a good thing if you're getting a Mudskipper that looks very skinny and underweight, do a deworming session before you put it in the tank as well. I mean, I can't run a deworming session with probably killing off everything in there. So you have to have a quarantine set up beforehand and then introduce your Mudskipper to its main tank, basically. So that's a good thing, to run a deworming session for 2 weeks, 3 weeks before you basically put it together with other Mudskippers or other tank. Because once you have issues in your main tank, like I can't probably catch some of these guys because they will just disappear under their burrows on the ground, and that means they're going to have to dig up everything. So quarantining your fish beforehand is to recommend. Like just Praziquantel is, I think, name of one of those fish medications, right, that you can put on. But otherwise very tolerant, and of course salinity as well. You get a lot of invertebrates as well. I mean, parasites and stuff that doesn't deal with salt that well either. In the wild, I've seen cases of some what's the name of those guys? Like fish lice a little bit as well, but they're probably not doing that well still, being stuck on a Mudskipper. I've seen mosquitoes on Mudskippers. That's really interesting, because I don't think many mosquitoes feed on fish usually.
No.
Wouldn't have thought so, no.
Yeah. Is stress something that do they get a problem with, like stressed out? Like some fish can get quite stressed under certain conditions. Is Mudskippers prone to that as well? And
so basically constant bullying. And I think also if you keep, I've had some people and one of my old workmates as well, the blue light in aquarium LED lights, they don't like that, it seems.
Oh, really?
Yeah, don't know why. Could be something with the autonomy of the eye or something, but yeah, so it seemed like they don't seem to fare that well. If they can avoid that light in a setup, they will. But sometimes they don't have much options, right? We put them in a confined environment and there's not enough, space to disappear. I mean, half the idea with having mangroves in here and lots of branches is that they have areas where they can tuck themselves away from the light as well. Just give them all the different options, but that could be something. And of course, bad substrate, too sharp. I've seen them being kept on like volcanic rock blocks. They're really sharp. They can scratch you really well. And imagine a fish with quite a nice soft belly. The belly's quite soft on these guys as well. So even for I've seen them jumping up on a little ledge or something, the stomach just goes flatter out on the side. So it's quite squishy, in a way. It's not like it's doesn't have any big scales on its belly, even if it's moving around. It's probably because the substrate is supposed to be nice and soft. It seems like sand, for example, can be very coarse on them. So again, people like, oh, I can't get mud, I'll just keep them on sand. But again, that's not always great. That can probably be more problems than what it benefits. So if you can, mud is the best practice substrate for these guys for sure.
If someone came up to you that just all of a sudden I want to dip my toes into Mudskippers, I want to give it a go, what would be the bit of advice or the bit of help that you would send them? Where would you send them? Obviously, you've shown the book. You'd get them to read through, what would be your way of helping them into this journey with Mudskippers?
First of all, you need to think outside the box a bit. This is not really your ordinary fish. And if you want to have other fish with your Mudskipper, then maybe start rethinking that as well. Because you should aim, if you want to have Mudskippers, just aim at Mudskippers, really, in a way. If you have a larger setup, maybe you could try to do a whole natural environment, with crabs and snails and things. Snails, by the way, really great as a cleanup crew. Malaysian trumpet snails move around the mud as well, pick up any food scraps, leftovers. Really good tank mate in those regards. And nerids, the algae grazing snails as well, work really well in brackish conditions too. So snails are great compartments. That could easily be kept in a setup together. Also start thinking, like, if you want to, like, say, hey, I want to have a Mudskipper in a 60, 80 liter tank, I was like, nah, it's going to be too small as well, So you need to think large, but also think outside the box. You can never go too large. It's require a lot of work, like, constant monitoring, and do your research. Definitely make sure that you can provide all of the requirements that is needed for keeping these guys. Ask around, definitely, other people and their experiences. And are you committed to this, to 100%? Otherwise, if you're not committed to another life form and what it needs, then maybe get something else, or a soft toy Mudskipper or something.
So when you set this tank up, do you have to go through the normal cycling process?
So I think that depends a little bit on where you are and water quality on tap water and things like that.
Okay.
Because these guys, they don't, utilize the water at the same way as other fish. Yeah. And if you're setting up a new setup, I would definitely have it running for a little while before introducing fish, just to get a bit of temperature, making sure the temperatures are at this stable. But they're also so quickly adaptable to change to these different conditions. But a whole different cycling, not really.
Okay.
You can start a little bit early, basically, to say so. Because they are so tolerant to ammonia levels that if you have a little bit higher ammonia, that's fine for these guys, But ideally you wouldn't. But can you get everything sorted beforehand so you can make sure that you don't encounter the problems while you actually have the fish? But think more somewhere between a fish, frog, salamander in terms of husbandry, but it is its own thing. It's not your normal fish. I'm not sure I would even call it a fish sometimes. Fishapod, maybe. I would call it a fishapod.
We spoke before we went live about how my daughter's been trying to convince me to get an axolotl, and I thought that maybe a Mudskipper might be a good option to kind of breach that, as I would prefer one of them over an axolotl. And I think I might be having to convince her now that a Mudskipper is a better option than an axolotl, to see if I can get one of them into the house. So you've definitely filled me with some enthusiasm and some really, really valuable insight and information on this live. So I think it's been fantastic. So thank you very much for that.
No, you're more than welcome. Yeah. I think they're actually easier to care than an axolotl. If you tick the boxes, if you meet all the requirements.
You're right.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. The amount of information that you brought out today and this is just phenomenal. So thank you very much for that in your time. We've run through all of the questions that we've got listed, and we've only actually asked 3 of them. So you've answered all of our questions without us even having to ask them, which doesn't happen very often. So So that was fantastic. So thank you very much for that.
You're more than welcome, and thank you for having me as well. That was very exciting. I can't believe I actually spoke for 2 hours about this. I could probably keep going on.
I'm sure we could. And John, have you got any other questions that you want to know?
No. I think we have literally covered every aspect of Mudskippers, which was our goal tonight, or this morning, or this afternoon. So yeah, thank you. Thanks for all the knowledge.
Yeah, very exciting.
We like to finish our live streams with what we call a quick school of six, which is six quick questions that are not here to put you on the spot, but every now and then they do. So my first question for you is, in a coin toss, do you call heads or tails?
The what?
And if you're doing a coin toss, heads or tails?
Sorry.
Yeah.
The coin toss. I would say head.
Cool. Are you a tea or a coffee drinker?
Tea, but I drink mostly coffee.
Are we alone in the universe?
No.
Cool. If you could have a meal with someone alive or dead, fictional or real, from any point in time, who would that be?
Fictional as well. Oh my god! Now you really put me on the spot there.
The one that gets most people.
I would actually like to know my grandpa on my mother's side. He passed away before I actually got to know him, and he seems to have been quite an interesting guy. He passed away very early on. I think he had a heart attack when he was 42. So yeah, that would have been my live person probably. Yeah, a fictional one would probably be, I don't know. Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Paper, scissors, rock. So what's your first call?
Rock.
Cool. And what is your unicorn species of fish, whether it be taking photos, seeing them in the wild, keeping them, spawning them? What's that one that's eluded you that you've always wanted to get your hands on?
Well, I actually just ticked off that box last year, seeing a gold-spotted Mudskipper in Thailand. That was something, because it's the only schooling Mudskipper that actually lives together in a group and moves together, which is really cool. But now I've kind of ventured on actually seeing Parathalmodon September radiatus, the ant-eating one, in the wild. And I've managed to track down a couple of locations on iNaturalist of where they can be found. Now I just need to go there.
Nice. Cool. And last question.
And seeing it in breeding coloration, the male. Because it's that amazing.
Where can people find you, or if they want more information on Mudskippers, where's a good source for them to go?
That would be the Mudskipper group on Facebook. So it's called the Mudskippers, I think. Yeah, the Mudskippers. Yeah. Otherwise, that is probably the easiest way to find me regarding Mudskippers.
Cool. Thank you very much for your time. It's been greatly appreciated.
Again.
Yeah, you've definitely opened up my eyes to the world of Mudskippers, and I know you've opened up the people that have been watching's eyes to the Mudskippers. A comment that Zen made in the first couple of minutes of the stream, I saw, and I thought this is going to be the perfect way to close. Zen has said that Mudskippers are the best Muppet-eyed, web-fingers little critters ever. And I think that is quite fitting for us to end on that. So thank you very much for your time. It's been greatly appreciated. Thank you, everybody who's been there with us. I've loved every single minute of this, and I'm sure a lot of you have as well. So thank you so much for your time today.
Awesome. Yes.
Have a good weekend, everybody.
Have a good one.
Yeah.